Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Round 6 of the Tata Steel Masters, and I'm going to look at the game between Fabiano Caruana and Anish Giri. This was very tense. Both players looking to kind of get their tournament going, and I think it's interesting to see that here Caruana went with this, so it's a reti, and he's not following a sort of main line. I mean, b3 is not so unorthodox. I mean, basically, it's just a normal reti with the double fianchetto. And Giri is playing basically a reversed London system. A very, very standard way for black to play. Very acceptable. It's just a very balanced position. So black wants to sort of bite away at the queen side like that, so that's prevented with a3. I say prevented, it means that after a4 the pawn will come to b4. c6 and rook e1. Okay, this is normal, of course. White wants to just advance with pawn to e4. There we go, the bishop is tucked away, and e4. And now we have this sort of tension in the centre. White doesn't want to take because black will just recapture with the c-pawn. White gains nothing. Black can sometimes take here to put a bit of pressure on the e-pawn. But in this case, well, both sides wait. But this is the move that both sides are kind of angling for. e5. White would like to do this to try and push black's pieces out of the way, and then white tries to attack on the king side, and black is kind of provoking it. Queen b6, this is all about perhaps playing a4 and then c5. That becomes an option. So now Caruana plays a4 to block that pawn permanently. And rook c8. So the waiting game continues. If e5, then knight e8, and that knight could spring round to a6, and then maybe this pawn could advance. And well, once that knight reaches b4, then in combination with that bishop and the c-pawn, well, there's some pressure on these two pawns. That's basically one of the ideas. And white's attack on the king side, very hard to get that going when this bishop controls this lovely diagonal. So that's why Fabi waited with rook c1. So it's about protecting that pawn. That's the base of the chain. And he might have in mind perhaps advancing with e5 and maybe even d4. And now Anish plays a really provocative move, bishop c5. I mean, obviously, you know, white has the chance to play this move, for example, but that means that would weaken the squares on, or, well, weaken the e4 square, and so that bishop would come into the game. So finally, Caruana pushes on with the pawn. Giri retreats. And now, well, you don't have to play d4 straight away. Let's keep this bishop sort of biting on that pawn on d3. So knight f1. Basically, white's chances in this position lie on the king side. Somehow, Caruana has to shift his pieces over. But, you know, this bishop is sort of pointing in the wrong direction here. You know, it would be wonderful if it were on d3. Obviously, that's just impossible for all kinds of reasons. And this bishop is also sort of the wrong side. You know, that bishop would like to be on this square. So it's not easy for white to actually get this attack rolling. And what's black doing? Well, queen d8 from Giri. Well, the idea behind that is clear. He wants to get some counterplay on the queen side, rather, with b5. Knight e3. So this knight starts to swing over. Knight c7. And king h1. Okay, this is interesting. So, I mean, I've seen this kind of strategy take place in this position, playing rook g1, and then bishop here and g4, g5 to open up the g file. That is a known strategy here, so perhaps that's what king h1 is all about. But after b5, well, we see another reason behind king h1 actually. But I do think, you know, if white wants to play a kind of quite outlandish attack, then that's possible. But there's another reason, because basically later on he wants to play f4 and he wants to take the king off this diagonal. Knight d4. So looks at that pawn, looks at this one, but also basically the idea is to prepare f4 and f5. That's how he's going to get his play on the king side. Pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn. Knight b6. See, this pawn is loose, but that would kind of open things up for black on the c file, and don't forget this one is hanging as well. Rook a1, knight a6, knight b3. Here's interesting moments. There's Giri puts the bishop back on e7. It's kind of a counterintuitive move here for black that the computers like a lot. This is quite a computery move. It's not very human to give up that beautiful dark squared bishops, but the computer likes this. After queen takes, just c5, so this just gets these pawns going. It has to be said that that knight is a useful piece, attacking piece for white, so eliminating it, not a bad idea. And this is a very straightforward plan, knight b4 and c4. Or pawn takes and again c5, and you just want to get this pawn going. So it's all about opening up the diagonal for that bishop, opening up the c file. It's actually very dangerous. But instead, Giri played bishop e7. And presumably he just felt his position was okay anyway. He wasn't sort of looking for kind of counterintuitive moves. And here, yeah, Giri kind of hesitates with queen d7. I think it's better to play knight b4. And after f5, just keep going with c5. Anyway, f4 played, queen d7. And great move from Caruana, f5. He just goes for it on the king side. I think he has to, because if he messes about for much longer, then c5 and potentially c4 or indeed knight a4. I think white's position is falling apart there. So he has to just pursue the initiative on the king side. Pawn takes pawn, queen f3, knight c5, knight on the rim comes back into play. And d4. You don't have to play d4. Bishop h3 is also an interesting possibility, but d4, bishop e7, bishop h3. So threat to take here. And now Caruana really goes for it. So you can see that bishop, which was the pride and joy of black's position, is now locked in by these pawns. So just in that respect, white must have some compensation. But that square is available for the knight. I know it's covered at the moment, but if that knight ever moves. But okay, let's see. g4 played by Caruana. Excellent move. I mean, it's kind of clear that if this diagonal opens, then that could be fun for white. But also, this knight wants to get into the game. f4, good move. So if queen takes, well, it's possible, but you know, black can block with bishop g5. But instead, g5 from Caruana, very energetic, hitting the queen. Queen a7. And here, Caruana takes the rook. which is a very strange decision. We'll look at that in a second. Here, knight g4 is an excellent move. So obviously threatening to take on h6, among other things. If bishop takes, then bishop c1, that bishop finally comes into the game. And this gives white tremendous compensation. I mean, you know, black's king is potentially in trouble. I mean, these bishops are wonderful. And the bishop on h7, of course, blocked in. Great compensation. Or pawn takes pawn. And bishop a3, I do like that move. Once these bishops are exchanged, then the knight has the f6 square available. Wow, what a contrast between the knight on g4 and the bishop on h7. What a miserable piece. Immured on h7. Okay, so let's go back. Instead of playing knight g4, Caruana took the booty. But here, I mean, black has fantastic compensation for the exchange. So if the bishop goes back, then knight c4. I mean, suddenly this looks great with the pawn on e3. Caruana played e6, so getting tricky. You know, looking to play here. But bishop g5, excellent move. And now that pawn is guarded. Here, I mean, white could exchange queens, but I mean, black is definitely not worse in that position. Black has two pawns for the exchange. Looks pretty nice for black, actually. Computer thinks it's about equal, but I think in that endgame, well, I think I would prefer black there with that knight hopping in and the potential to move this bishop and get bishop number 2 in the game. I can understand why Caruana certainly didn't want to look at that one, but what he did, bishop d7, yeah, it's tricky, because if knight takes, queen takes, and white is back in the game. But this is not pleasant for white, with that wonderful pawn on e3. Knight c4, securing the pawn. Bishop c5, and the queen switches over, so black's king certainly not in danger. I mean, the only piece that needs to come into the game is the bishop on h7. But that's going to be possible very soon. Bishop f6 played. They were in time pressure now, both players. Rook e8 is a stronger move, but anyway, bishop f6 is not bad. Rook b1, g5. There we go. So that's Giri's idea, of course, to bring this bishop into the game, and it does look very strong. Problem is, after bishop f5, actually Caruana was in with a shout in this position, but they were down, both players down to their final minute. It looks tremendous for black. I think if Caruana had had more time here, he'd have found the correct move. Here, white can play queen h5. So if bishop takes, queen takes, rook check. What this does is nudge the rook away from the e file. So the rook will have to go to, I don't know, let's say, it's not very attractive, but let's say rook g8. And then the bishop can be supported, and white is actually back in the game. That bishop controls f8, stops the rook going there. And without the rook behind it, that pawn is actually sort of under control for the moment. It's a really tricky position, but Caruana with white would be back in the game. But, well, to find a move like queen h5, you need time. And as I said, he was under a minute here, and he'd not only played, well, an inferior move to queen h5, he actually just made a blunder. Rook b6, I mean, that is terrible. He just allowed knight takes rook, and I'm sure this was not a strategic sacrifice. He just blundered the rook, basically. Well, blundered the exchange, but terrible. And after this, Giri was, well, how many pawns up? Just the 3 pawns up with a completely winning position, and he duly put the game away in very competent style. This is a nice move. He wants to keep the queen here so that there's always mate threatened. Check. And he doesn't mind marching his king up the board because actually it's going to be safe. Of course, queen takes rook, queen f2 mate. Excuse me. And anyway, the king marches up the board. We've seen this before, of course. Let me see, it was Vidit's game, wasn't it? Yeah, Vidit did this against Dubov. This isn't quite as spectacular as that game, but, well, the king basically just comes the other side of these pawns and is completely safe. And here Caruana resigned, quite understandably. It's completely caved in. Rook f4 happening next, and there really isn't any defence at all for white. So, that game was really on the edge. But Anish Giri held firm, kept his cool, and managed to win the game. Great pity for Caruana. I mean, that was an awful blunder. I mean, he's under pressure in this position anyway. He's gone badly wrong. It seems to me that Fabi, he's struggling to find his touch at the moment. Maybe it's getting back from the sort of long break after the pandemic, after the candidates tour, disappointment of the candidates tournament. It's tough for him. But yeah, let's hope that he can find his feet again. Anyway, listen, let's have a look at the scores and the standings. So we have Magnus Carlsen, Vidit Gujarati and Shahriar Mamedyarov all on 4 out of 6. Carlsen beat Rapport today in pretty smooth fashion. Let me see. Next round, round 7 on Saturday. Big pairings. We have Magnus Carlsen playing black against Pragyanananda. That's going to be really interesting to see. We have Mamedyarov black against Rapport. And we have Vidit black against Van Foreest. So those are the top pairings. If you want to check out the details, tatasteelchess.com. And I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks for watching.